The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and its voice is heard on the distant hill because the caged bird sings of freedom. Oh Lord, I want two wings to guide my feet. Oh Lord, I want two wings to guide my mind. Oh Lord, I want two wings to hold my arms so the world won't do me no harm.
Chapter 2: The Sea and Freedom. As George busily attended to a bowl of freshly picked blueberries, Margaret looked up to see Josephine, elegantly dressed, gliding through the bramble and shrubs toward them. "Well," exclaimed Margaret, "what a pleasant surprise! I didn't hear you were planning to come by these parts." "Oh, you're quite right," Josephine warmly replied. "It was unexpected, to be sure. Robert is on leave of his porter duties while the ferry is being refitted for parts here in Halifax." "Oh!" exclaimed Margaret. "But the ladies in Boston must be displeased, I'm sure of it." Josephine laughed. "The ladies of Boston will never tire of new fashion. It won't take long for me to be busy again." And shifting her focus back to Margaret, she added, "Besides, there's far more important things in life." Josephine lifted a basket toward Margaret. "Look what I brought you. Not me, mind you. It's extra stew beef and vegetables that Robert's mother asked me to bring over to you." "You're all far too kind, Josephine." "Oh, not at all," Josephine quickly replied. She glanced over at the boy near Margaret's feet, then softly whispered, "Tell me, how you keepin'?" Margaret sighed deeply. "Well, let's see. My goodness, I seem to have been quite busy of late," as she looked over at George. Turning back to Josephine, she feigned a smile. "I'm okay, really." Josephine offered a brief smile in return, but she couldn't hide her concern. "Forgive me. Your business is your own, and I have no intention to pry, but I heard it's been hard for James to get delivery routes." Margaret slowly replied, "We're getting old, me and James. I wonder if—" And her voice fell to a whisper as she turned her head away from George. "I wonder how long we could take care of him. James just isn't himself these days." Josephine glanced again at George. She smiled tenderly and whispered, "All I can say, Auntie Maggie, is that the boy is fortunate the good Lord brought him to your door. God only knows what his life may have become otherwise." Josephine rested her hand on Margaret's shoulder. As Margaret smiled, Josephine hugged her and stooped down and rubbed George's nappy head of hair. "And you, little man, I'm going to come back and take you down to the swimming hole. I reckon some cool water would do my feet good." George quickly shot up his head, a big stained grin now covering his face. "Oh, I'll come with you, Auntie Josephine. I wouldn't want you to fall in the water." Josephine let out a laugh. "Well, what a gentleman, and a quick-witted one at that. All right, I'll come by, and you can take me down to the water." With a wink, Josephine turned and made her way back to Dixon House across the yard. It was close to dinner when George wandered into the house after being down at the water with Josephine. As he stepped through the door, he paused. The house was eerily quiet. He slowly made his way down the single hallway and stopped at the entrance of the kitchen. Margaret was standing in front of the counter with her back to George, staring out the small window that overlooked the yard. As George went to sit down at the table, Margaret spun around with an anxious look. At the sight of the boy, she sighed. "Oh, George, you scared me." Her voice then fell off. "I'm afraid he's been at Raleigh's canteen Far too long now. In silence, George watched Margaret move to the stove and set a fire. She then brought a jug of water over and poured it into a pot that was on the table. She went back to the counter, took the basket of food Josephine had brought over earlier that day, and sat next to George. Without looking up, Margaret asked, "Would you like to cut these for me?" George took the knife and started working on the vegetables, as Margaret began cutting the beef into small chunks. Together they took turns placing food into the pot, and when they were done, she got up and placed the pot into the cooking stove. And as she slowly stirred the mixture of meat and vegetables, George continued to quietly watch her. After a few minutes, she put the ladle down and returned to sit with George at the table. Neither appeared anxious to speak about anything. The tranquility of the moment was disrupted by the front door to the house being thrown open. Margaret instantly shot up from the table. George looked up to see Margaret's husband, James, stumbling into the kitchen. Margaret didn't greet him, but quickly moved over to the stove. By now dusk had come over the settlement, and the fire with the stove cast a shadow behind where James stood. Margaret glanced nervously behind her. "Well, come on," she said. "Have a seat. Dinner won't be long." James was having trouble standing straight. He took a few wobbly steps toward her, then stopped in the center of the kitchen. George watched as he scanned the table, a deep furrow building over his brow as he set his eyes upon the rations. He slowly sat in the chair across from the boy. George remained very still, not taking his eyes off him. Margaret went over to grab plates on the shelf and placed them on the table. She noticed him staring at the extra food still on the table and quickly turned back to the stove. Her voice grew even more nervous. "You must be wondering how it is I got all these rations. Well, Josephine brought them over." "Josephine! Ha!" James scowled. "She can't keep her nose where it belongs." Margaret tensed. In a nervous tone, she replied, "Josephine cares about us, is all. And you know how fond she is of George." "Is that so?" James scoffed. "Then why don't she take the boy?" Margaret turned quickly back to the stove. Without looking over to George, her voice quivered as she spoke. "James, you know we the only home the boy has." James grimaced as he took a long, hard stare at George, then suddenly stumbled over to the boy and pulled him up from the chair. "This boy," James sneered as he turned again to Margaret, "like the ones you brought home before. And what happened then, Margaret? Need I remind you?" James again stared at George. As he began teetering, he clenched tighter on the boy's arm. He then snarled at the boy, "Let Josephine take care of you. She's such a saint. I'm done feeding other people's kids." And James started turning toward the back door with the boy in tow. George quickly jerked and tried to pull himself away. James turned, his eyes suddenly filled with rage. He slapped George across the face. The boy gasped, then flailed his arms and legs against James. The older man threw a fist into the boy's side. George bent over, clutching the edge of the table to keep himself from falling to the floor. Margaret leaped toward the boy, but she was too late. James flung George over the table and across the floor. Margaret rushed over to where George lay motionless in the corner. She knelt over him, pleading for the boy to get up. As she tried to pull George toward her, he suddenly gasped. Margaret pulled him closer, but he defiantly pushed against her. He finally pulled himself up and staggered toward the door. "George!" Margaret cried after him. "Please don't go. George, you come back here." Halfway into the hallway, George turned back to look at Margaret. She was folded on the floor, desperately reaching her hand toward him. Her anguished cries filled the room. James stood in the center of the kitchen, silent and cold as stone. George looked at Margaret one last time, then turned and disappeared into the night. In the pale dusk, he stumbled down the yard and onto the rail tracks. He ran east along the line, and soon the last houses of the Campbell Road settlement faded into the darkness behind him. As the tracks veered south toward the city, he stepped off and pushed himself through the dense brush, stumbling down the ridge, until he came across a shed in the back of the slaughterhouse that stood near the mouth of the basin. He quickly flung the door open and threw himself inside. He laid across the ground, covered in damp straw. Alone in the dark, the boy started pounding his feet against the wall. Through the slats in the shed, George suddenly spotted a light being cast from the direction of the slaughterhouse. He quickly laid still, muffling his cries in the sleeve of his shirt. When the light finally vanished, George turned over and cried himself to sleep in the darkness. The sound of a bell ringing in the distance startled George as he lay curled in the dank ground. He squinted at the bright morning sunlight piercing through the walls of the shed. He hesitated, drew a deep breath, then sat up straight. Slowly, George pushed the door open and stepped outside. Almost instantly, the clean ocean air filled his chest, and the warmth of the sun's rays soaked his ebony skin like a balm. George opened his eyes wide to the blue sky above him. The flight of a gull swooped above him from across the slopes and over the ocean water. He stood still as he followed the bird into the horizon. Then the clang of the bell pushed him back to earth, and he quickly headed toward the direction from where it came. He pushed himself through the brush and continued back along the tracks. He crossed onto the road and continued until he stood in front of the Seaview Baptist Church, where the peal of the bell rang from its steeple. George cautiously entered the front entrance and slid onto a bench in the far corner. On this particular morning, as voices lifted into the rafters and the organ rang out a rich melody, the sound of a trumpet rose above the chorus. George perched himself on the bench, just high enough to see a man swinging his brass instrument in rhythm with the swaying and clapping hands of the congregation. At last, after a full morning of worship, the preacher exhaled a final crescendo of glory and hallelujah, and everyone was quickly beckoned outside to join a picnic. George didn't hesitate. He joined the first stream of people toward the carts propped up in the yard and started scooping pastries and sandwiches into a shirt which he stretched out like a ragged canopy. By the time he got to the second cart, bodies were pressing in on him from every side. He spun and pirouetted around the crowd, gathering as much as he could before he could be out of reach of it entirely. George noticed a man proceeding to place the last slice of cheese on his serviette. Someone caught the man's attention, and he turned his head the other way from where George was standing. George quickly reached around and snatched the cheese. As he dropped it into the fold of his shirt, he felt someone grab his elbow and twist him around. Caught in the sins of greed and gluttony, he looked up into the eyes of his prosecutor. Well, it seems God's mercy was upon the boy, for it was Josephine who stood before him. Well, Josephine said with a wry smile, if it ain't my dear sweet George. George looked down into his shirt and proceeded to lift the bundle toward Josephine as if he were producing an atoning sacrifice. Would you like one of my sandwiches? Josephine laughed. Oh, no. Something tells me you need this food more than I do. But I'll tell you what, she continued. I have a feeling there's a lot we need to catch up on. Let's find a spot to sit while you enjoy your spoils, shall we? George nodded. Together they left the church yard and strolled down the road until they came to an opening that looked over the water. George sat down and spread his food upon his lap. Josephine sat next to him and watched George abandon himself to devouring every morsel he had gathered. And when George seemed to have his fill, Josephine began asking him many questions. Before long, Josephine had come to piece together much of what had transpired. As George was swallowing the last of his food, they heard a voice behind them. "Well, there you are. Been looking all over for you." Robert came bounding across the road and sat next to Josephine. He quickly looked over to George, sitting next to her. "And what company are you keeping, my lady?" He quickly winked at George and gave a big grin. Josephine turned and smiled at George as well. He continued, "Well, George, this is indeed a pleasant surprise. My wife wondered where you had disappeared to, and here you are." George looked down across the ocean. Seeing the boy staring off into the distance, Robert leaned over and asked, "Have you ever thought of traveling the seas?" George looked closer at the many vessels crossing the Narrows. He watched the massive steamships churn the waters as billows of smoke trailed above. He marveled at the sleek schooners skimming through the water. There were merchant ships and military cruisers and smaller fishing trawlers, all traversing the open water like on a road with endless directions. "No, sir," George wistfully replied. Robert joined the boy, gazing across the water. "Do you know why I love the sea, George?" The boy shook his head. Robert leaned into the boy and said, "When all the passengers retire from the decks, and the night is late, and the moon is the only light over the water, I stretch out over the bow and listen to the rhythm of the waves." Robert moved his hands as if they were swimming through the wind. "And in those moments, son, the land and all its troubles seem so far away. I listen to the water below, parting before me like Moses standing before the Red Sea, and I feel free." They ended up sitting for a while on the slopes, looking over the ocean as Robert shared his joy of listening in on travelers recounting their many adventures overseas, of learning about exotic food and strange artifacts that came aboard the ships from foreign lands. For the rest of the afternoon, George strode up and down the livestock trails that ran through the pastures on the high plateau to the west. He took the paths that connected fishing holes along the steep rocky shores heading toward the Narrows. Sitting alone, he stared over the water again, watching the boats drift along the currents beneath him. Eventually, the shadows became long and the wind cool as the sun fell further away to the horizon. Then George quickly stood up and started toward Josephine and Robert's house. George took the long way over the ridge, avoiding the place where Margaret and James lived. As he approached from the back of the yard, George could hear Josephine and Robert chattering at the front of the house. He sprinted around the corner. Standing on the edge of the steps was Robert, dressed in a black suit with large silver buttons fastened all the way up to a very high collar. Resting on his head was a stiff black cap with a shiny peak. Black wide trousers fell straight down from his waist, covering his shoes. Crouched on the step right below him was Josephine, furiously trying to pin the end of the pant leg. Robert teetered as he tried to peer over Josephine. "How much longer, Josephine?" Robert cried. "We're going to be late." "And it's my fault you waited so long to tell me you needed new pants," Josephine retorted. "Well, Robert began to argue. "I thought I told you on the way here, baby doll." But Josephine was having none of that. "Oh," she snapped, "don't you baby doll me, mister." George had been quietly listening to their bickering on the sidelines, but suddenly he interjected. "Oh, wait. Where are you going?" In unison, Robert and Josephine turned toward the direction of the boy's voice. George was staring back at them with a most anxious look. Josephine put down her thread. Robert cleared his voice and gently replied, "Oh, well, we're heading back to Boston, son. The boat's ready to go, you see, and we set sail from Halifax first thing in the morning." George didn't wait for him to finish. "Take me with you," he yelled. "I want to go." Josephine quickly left the steps and knelt in front of George. Taking hold of his hand, she looked into his eyes. "Now, George," she gently whispered, "you know you can't go with us." "Why not?" exclaimed George. "I'll be good, I promise." Josephine glanced back at Robert, who just stared on with a helpless look. Josephine turned back to George. She placed her hands gently upon his shoulders and said softly, "Look, baby, we can't take you with us. Besides, this is your home." Abruptly, George pushed Josephine's hands away. "This ain't my home." Tears started to run down the boy's cheeks. Josephine reached up to dry them, but George stepped away. She sighed and folded her hands into her lap. Robert looked on in silence. Josephine sighed again and said, I'm sorry, George. Next time, maybe you can come with us." "Ain't nobody wants me," he yelled. "Nobody." And he fled from their sight. George aimlessly wandered the shoreline until, as dusk began to set in, he found himself again near the path that led to the slaughterhouse. He followed it through the brush and into the clearing below. From the slaughterhouse, George could see a throng of workers hauling carts full of barrels down to the dock. George followed them down, staying in the shadows. For some time he watched them work. Eventually, one man standing upon the brig began yelling orders, and the workers started filing onto the cargo ship. By this time, night had fully set in, and in all the commotion, they did not see that a boy had slipped on board behind them. Of course, getting on board that ship was really the easy part for George. But God only knows how he managed to survive the 3-day journey across the ocean undetected. But there he was, a 6-year-old boy huddled in the dark below, finding himself being tossed and fro by the relentless swaying of the ship, while having to listen to the endless groaning of the keel as it crashed against the gigantic waves. The precarious position George placed himself in would have been heightened by the fact that he had absolutely no clue where or when the ship would ever come ashore. This, to say the least, could have ended a lot worse for the young boy. But survive he did. How relieved George must have been for the groaning and shuddering to finally end, as the water stilled beneath the ship and the big cargo door high above him be thrown open to reveal a clear, bright sky. As he dashed up the ladder, his lungs gasping at the fresh air, George would have been immediately greeted by an astonished crew of sailors clamoring about the deck. And like any young boy caught in a place where he didn't belong, he would have instinctively run as fast as he could. Scurrying down the long wood plank to the dock, he would have disappeared into the crowd along the pier before anyone would have put together what happened. Standing alone in a sea of people, George could not have imagined the scene surrounding him. He had landed in Boston, the gateway to the Americas, built at the rise of the Atlantic trade to the New World. 5-storied warehouses extended almost half a mile into the sea, standing on massive wharves. Giant ships filled the harbor. As far as his eye could see, there would have been soaring sail masts and enormous smokestacks of transatlantic steamers lining the waters. Turning around, he would have seen, to his amazement, railway trains coasting high in the air along tracks elevated on massive shimmering steel pillars. Wagons would be crisscrossing underneath, veering down wide avenues. Majestic buildings with brass trimmings glittering in the sunlight would be standing on either side. And so many white people. As they streamed past him, he no doubt marveled at the extravagance of their clothing. Women would have been wrapped in broad lingerie dresses that floated just above the pavement, while on their heads would have sat wide hats with lavish garlands of flowers flowing over. The men sported impressive top hats and crisp 3-piece suits with silky ties tucked in, along with shiny black shoes. Even the colored folk passing George would have been decked in remarkably handsome clothing, at least compared to those from the humble settlement of Africville. Lost in the wonder of this new world, George continued to wander down this grand avenue. Eventually, George came upon a smaller wharf where several ferries were docked. Standing at the bottom of the plank beside the first ferry, he noticed a man in a long dark suit and hard cap helping passengers disembark. Flashing in the sun were bright silver buttons on the cuffs of his jacket. He fought through the oncoming crowd of people making their way from the ship. Finally, he approached the man in the suit from behind and grabbed his arm. "Robert!" he yelled excitedly. "It's George!" The man turned and gave a curious look at the boy pulling on his sleeve. George immediately stepped back. "You're not Robert," he exclaimed. "Why are you wearing his suit?" The man took a long, hard look at the boy. Slowly he replied, "Well, as for the suit, young man, this one's mine. And as for Robert, I reckon he's at home enjoying his leave from work." "Well, I need to see him," George quickly responded. "He'll be back here in 2 days' time." The porter peered closer. "What did you say your name was, son?" "George," he quietly repeated. "Okay, George. I'll let him know you were asking. In the meantime, you better get back to your folks." At this, the porter began to scan the line of people. Before he could turn his attention back to the boy, George quickly disappeared again into the crowd. He wandered the streets for the rest of the day until wagons began to pull back to the warehouses. People climbed the stairs to the elevated platforms and disappeared into the trains leaving downtown. George began rummaging through odd boxes left by vendors. Finding a handful of fruit, he left the main avenue into a quieter alley and sat down behind a stoop under a small doorway. As he finished eating his spoils, George leaned his head against the wall. Before long, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. Several days later, George was crouched behind a wagon, propped on the edge of the main street along the Boston Harbor. He was peering intently through the crowd at a cart of fruit in the distance. George waited until the coast was clear, and when he saw his moment, he dashed toward the cart. He grabbed a handful of apples and turned to run. Unfortunately, George tripped as he tried to jump in between two people passing by and sprawled onto the ground. The vendor spun around. Seeing the boy, he yelled, "You little varmint," as he clenched his fists and started for the boy. For a second, George froze. Then he quickly stumbled to his feet and fled into the crowd. He danced around people, heading in every direction. George quickly looked back to see whether the man was still chasing him. And as he did so, however, he ran right into a person standing in the crowd. And before he could fall backwards, the person grabbed his shoulders and brought him closer. Staring down at him was a face he would have immediately recognized. "George!" Josephine exclaimed as she wrapped her arms around him. Letting out a deep sigh, she said, "Thank God! I've been looking all over for you." It was some days before Josephine and Robert could find the time to return to Africville. Josephine had already sent a letter ahead to Margaret explaining all that had happened. Apparently, the porter, who George had mistaken to be Robert, had a wife who hired Josephine on occasion to fix her dresses. Shortly after her husband's encounter with George, she made a point of sharing this strange tale with Josephine, recalling that this boy was desperate to find Robert. Josephine, hardly believing it could be the same George from Africville, nevertheless accompanied the woman to inquire further with her husband. But after listening to his description of the boy, Josephine was convinced that George indeed had found his way to Boston. Robert and Josephine had been scouring the city streets in the hope of finding the boy before something terrible had happened to him. And, by sheer luck, George had literally run into her down by the wharf. Soon, Josephine wrote, they would be on their way to Margaret's house with the boy. As Robert pulled the wagon up to the house, Margaret peered outside the front door. Josephine quickly jumped off and greeted her. Robert led George around to the back of the porch, where the two of them sat quietly as the woman talked. After a long while, the back door opened. George looked over to see Auntie Maggie walking across the porch toward him. He quickly jumped up and hugged her. For a long moment, they stood with arms wrapped tightly around each other. Finally, Margaret squeezed his hand and started leading him into the house. As she passed Josephine and Robert, the two of them gave George a hug and assured them that they'd take him down to the ocean tomorrow before they returned once again to Boston. Life initially was fairly peaceful back in Africville. James had left on a delivery route quite far into New Brunswick. George would spend his days with Margaret helping with chores where he could, sitting on the porch, spending afternoons down at the water or up the ridge picking berries. On a couple of Sundays, Margaret attended the worship service at Seaview Baptist Church. After the services, Margaret and George would walk down to the ocean shore and collect pebbles. It was early autumn in those days, and life was good in Africville. A few weeks later, James came home. On the first night of his return, George was left alone in the living room while James and Margaret talked in the bedroom, their voices ebbing back and forth between shouting and whispers. George had fallen asleep on the couch and was awoken in the early morning by James marching out the front door and slamming it behind him. It was late the next evening before he came by the house again. No one said a word to each other for a few days. Eventually, as the days went by, people seemed content to move on, with George being part of the house. A couple months after George had run away to Boston, they were sitting in the living room when they heard a knock at the front door. James left the room to answer it. "Hello, can I help you?" George heard him say to the stranger. "I am Mr. A.R. Quinn of the Canadian Census Bureau," the man responded. "I am here compiling the profiles of all the residents for the 1901 federal census. Are you the head of this household? I am, James slowly replied. Then I will need from you the details of the former members of your household. Margaret quickly got up and joined James at the door. As the two of them came to the end of detailing the members of the household, the official noticed George standing just outside the living room. "And who is this?" he asked. Margaret and James spun around to see George staring at them. James looked stone-faced at the boy as Margaret gasped for air. "And who is this?" the official repeated. Margaret feigned a smile and turned to James at the door. "Why, our son, of course." The man stared at Margaret, waiting for her to continue. Finally, he said, "And his name?" Margaret quickly blurted, Yes, I'm sorry. George. George is his name." "Okay, then." The man looked down as he scribbled his book. "And his date of birth?" Margaret looked again at the boy. She was probably hoping for an answer, but George only stared back with a blank look on his face. She turned again and quickly smiled. Born April, the 5th of April." Margaret glanced feverishly back at George again before continuing. "And he would be 6 years old, but time does go by so fast, doesn't it?" The man looked strangely at Margaret. He appeared to ponder what she said before turning his page. "Okay," the man mused. "So, born on April 5th, 1896, and that would be George, and last name Dixson. Correct?" The man looked at James. James looked at Margaret. They both smiled and nodded. The official snapped his book shut. "That will be everyone, then?" James and Margaret again smiled at the official. "Yes, sir, that's everyone." At that, the man turned and headed back to the road. James closed the door. He stood still, his hand not moving from the latch, staring silently through the window pane. Margaret turned and looked at George. She smiled faintly. "Well, I guess you're one of us now." Then my dad's voice went silent. I heard him take a long sip of his coffee, and after clearing his throat, he chuckled slightly and said, "Well, besides a few pieces your great-aunt B threw in for good measure, therein lies the tale of your papa's great escape." And then he added, "I just wish I could say, and they lived happily ever after." This whole time I had been sitting in an armchair, immersed in this incredible tale my father recounted. As he finished, I continued to stare out the window, still trying to imagine all the details as he described them. "Yes," I gently added, "if only that was the ending. From what I recall, your father disappeared again not long after. What caused him to run away a second time?" "I'm not sure what happened," my father confessed. "I would guess more of the same of what he endured. But either way, it's true. Your papa didn't stick around very long. In fact, he was soon jumping boxcars on the trains that ran through the settlement, riding from Halifax all the way to Montreal. And then when he was about 11 years old, he stole away on a scooter, traveled around the world." I let out a laugh. Unbelievable. Around the world? Where did he go? My dad replied, well, this time, where he went and what he experienced, truly, God only knows. Not even your great Aunt B could get answers. So she left it at that. For as great a storyteller as she was, Aunt B was wise enough to know she could not do justice to the endless possibilities of what he experienced. In the end, some of the best stories are the ones left untold. And my father was happy enough to let his adventures go wherever people's imagination took them. My dad sighed and said, as for me, it's time to stretch my legs. Will you give me a call later, son? It was hard for me to leave the conversation with more questions than answers. But I did imagine the effort of recounting all these stories of the past had exhausted him. I let him go, but assured him I'd call again very soon. Chapter 3. Black in Indian Town. In double the languages, bigger than all of us in here together. We're used to a pattern of being excluded. But there will be nothing without us included. On these unceded indigenous lands, they've tried to subdue us. But yet here we stand, and it's here we are rooted. L. Jones. The next day, as soon as Dad picked up the phone and finished the ritual of getting his headset tilted correctly, I jumped into the question I was eager to ask. Dad, in the story your Aunt B told, I was thinking about Papa finding himself getting listed as a Dixon in the census after he ran away from Boston. It reminded me of a comment you've made on more than one occasion. You mentioned that your dad got upset whenever someone spelled his name wrong. Why did that bother him so much? My dad chuckled. Well, he began, for starters, your papa refused his whole life to say anything good about another Dixon. Whenever someone was mentioned who shared his last name, he would angrily mutter, "They don't have nothing to do with me." Then he'd go on about how people always misspell his name. He insisted his name be spelled with an X. He'd growl at us, "Don't want you spelling it Dickson or Dixson." In fact, Papa got so uptight about the spelling of his name, it became quite the amusing topic among my older siblings. "We are Dxons," they would jokingly sing in unison, outside of Papa's earshot, of course. Dad paused briefly, then added, "As a boy, it was just another way I saw your Papa as a complicated man." As Dad recalled my grandfather's strange obsession with his last name, it brought to mind a curious thing I had noticed in the census records. James and Margaret had a different spelling of their last name on every census taken, from the first in 1871 to the last in 1911. It would shift from Dickson to Dixon to Dixson, not to mention Dickson and back again. Of course, this wasn't unusual at the time, for many in the colored communities were not literate, and often they were content to let the official filling out the census write as he pleased. Maybe relationships with Papa had with those who shared his last name really did trigger him. Mind you, given my great Aunt Bee's account of Papa's time in Africville, Josephine Dixon was one person he would have been okay to be associated with. But nevertheless, it made me wonder if there were other Dixon characters who Papa might have had some unpleasant encounters with during his earlier years. I asked my father what he thought. My father pondered this idea for a moment. Well, as a matter of fact, he slowly began, there was another person who, from Papa's early years, would have shared his last name. Her name was Lena. Now, she was a Dickson, but most everyone knew her by her husband's name. Her husband was John O'Ree, a relative of the great Willie O'Ree from Fredericton, who became the first black professional hockey player in the NHL. He was a hero for so many of us young black kids growing up in those days. Dad's voice then shifted to a more serious tone. But make no mistake, Lena O'Ree became a legend in her own right as well, a real force in our community. You see, many kids of color grew up in a hostile environment, having to face all kinds of hateful treatment and constant bullying. As a result, a lot of us grew to feel either quite bitter towards society or small and diminished as human beings. But not Lena. From a young age, growing up in Indiantown on the north end of St. John, she had learned a vital lesson. If the fight didn't kill you, it's because you were stronger. Dad paused in this moment, I think to make sure that lesson sunk in. He then continued. Nothing kept Lena from doing what she put her mind to. In fact, at the young age of 17 years, Lena became the first black Canadian to host a radio show broadcast across the country. Of course, the station producers kept it silent about Lena O'Ree being a woman of color. But that didn't stop Lena from making her voice heard, though. In 1936, a few years after she gained popularity as a radio host, she decided to join the local YMCA. However, they refused her membership. After protesting, they told Lena she would require 5 other enrolled black women to socialize in the facility. Lena returned the next day with 10 black women. I could hear Dad laughing in the background as he reminisced on this story. He went on. The fact was, nothing could hold Lena back when she put her mind to it. Years later, in 1959, Lena made a decision that would impact black folk across the country. Lena took on the cause of having the color barrier lifted on all the hotels owned by the Canadian Pacific Company, and eventually the rail cars they owned as well. Now, for generations, black men had been relegated to working as porters on these rail cars. Now, thanks in large part to Lena, we could ride in passenger seats the same as any other. Dad paused briefly, then said, At first, I never understood why your papa showed such disdain for Lena O'Ree every time her name came up. After all, she did nothing but good for our community. But then I learned the real reason, son. I suddenly heard a shift in my father. In an excited tone, he declared, It had nothing to do with her. It turns out your father had a stubborn hatred for Lena's father, Ernest Dixon. Now, before I could process this, Dad quickly continued. Yeah, you see, after years of sailing around the world, George showed up on the port of St. John, New Brunswick. Now, the answer as to why he returned to the land he spent so much effort running away from, well, that rests with your papa. George could have set foot in 1,000 places to carry on his life journey. But I believe there are few coincidences in life, and what waited for him there, in the end, was his chance to be part of history. Oh, once again, I felt the weight of what Dad was saying as he paused to take a drink of water. Dad then cleared his throat and continued. But there he was, standing on the harbor of St. John, New Brunswick. And what he needed in that moment was a place to sleep. At this point in his life, George would have hardly known a soul in St. John, save one. Your grandfather called her Aunt Cassie, although none of my family, even Aunt Bee, had any idea how she was related to us. In fact, I don't recall ever meeting her, even though I heard she lived up in the North End the whole time I grew up in St. John. Nevertheless, she became the closest thing to a mother your grandfather ever had. When he signed up for the war, he listed Cassie as his next of kin. That's how close he felt to her. It's hard to say when George would have first met Cassie and how he knew where to find her when he stepped off the boat in St. John after being away for so long. But find her he did. And that's where the next chapter of his story begins. I quickly sat back in my chair as my father began the next tale. As George got off the ship, my father continued, he would have joined in with the stream of colored folk making their way past the busy merchant shops, around the social elite, chatting idly under the two-story bandstand in the middle of King Square, past the fancy hotels and courthouse, and onward to the lower east side of St. John. Before long, narrow streets would be lined with row houses propped against each other. One by one, folk would vanish into adjacent doors, until at last he stood by himself at the doorstep of a house. A moment passed after he knocked, until the door swung slowly open to reveal a middle-aged woman silhouetted by the dim light in the hallway behind her. At first she cast a suspicious eye at George as he stood just off the edge of the darkened street. As she peered again, a shocked expression came over her face. Then her face softened, and a wry smile appeared. "Well," she chuckled, "you were the last person I expected to see in one piece." "Well, come on in," the woman said as she beckoned him through the door. "You must be hungry." After chatting over a plate of food, the lady took a long, hard look at the young man sitting across from her. "I'd say you talk like a gentleman now. Yet you still stand no taller than a boy, so which are you?" Cassie said with a wink. George momentarily looked away in embarrassment, then abruptly straightened his shoulders. "I'm a gentleman, Aunt Cassie." The woman smiled again. "All right, so tell me, young sir, how long do you mean to stay in town?" "Well," George looked to the floor, then whispered, "I don't really know." Cassie looked closely at George. She hesitated for a moment, then gently responded. "Well, it happens I have an extra room to put you up till you find your way. I trust you can follow the rules of the house?" George quickly nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "All right, then," Cassie stated. "And I suppose you won't have any trouble doing a little work around here. I could use an extra set of hands." Just then a young man came bounding down the stairs. He appeared to be a few years older than George, dressed out in slacks and a button-down shirt. He stopped in front of the boy as he reached for his jacket on the hook. With barely a glance at George, he turned to Cassie. "Well, who's this?" he asked. "Well, son," the woman replied with a slight irritation in her voice, "this here is George, your cousin. He's going to stay with us for a little while. I'll put him up in the laundry room." Cassie paused and added, while turning her nose down to the older boy, "He's also willing to provide some much-needed help." The young man ignored her mother's comments as he quickly brushed past George toward the door. "Well, he better not go into my room," he flatly retorted. "I'll be back later. I'm just going to go see Jessie." "Figures," Cassie muttered. "I hardly see you now that Jessie caught your attention." "Gotta make the best of the time I have before I leave on the next rail car, Mama," the young man shot back as he disappeared down the steps. "See you." As the door closed behind him, Cassie sighed and turned her attention back to George. "That," she explained, "is my son, Ernest. You won't see a whole lot of him, I'm afraid. Come on, let's get you settled in." George soon realized that Cassie had use of his help after all. In the room where George was staying were laid piles of laundry that Cassie had collected from hotels and wealthy homeowners, all of which were overdue to be returned. She put George to work hauling down the bags to the back porch, then scrubbing and rinsing while Cassie hung them to dry before bringing them onto the dining room table to iron flat. True to his word, Ernest left to work on the railway not long after George arrived. Together, side by side, they worked at making a living for Cassie. In this moment of their lives, it was evident that both George and Cassie needed one another. Little did they know how much their relationship would grow in the coming years. In the months that followed, it became increasingly hard for Cassie to afford to live in the city. Without a husband to bring home wages, St. John's was a rough place for a single black woman to survive. From the beginning, many black migrants from the States were among the many British supporters who settled in the area after the American Revolution. And like other loyalists, they were promised land. However, the plots assigned to them were inadequate to farm, if they were assigned at all. To add insult to injury, St. John's City Charter of 1785 specifically excluded blacks from practicing a trade, selling goods, fishing in the harbor, or becoming freemen with a right to vote. These laws stood until 1870. In short, everything was designed by those with privilege to increase their lot in life, mostly at the expense of others. There were the few exceptions of black entrepreneurs who managed to find success in the lower end of St. John. Thomas Washington, for instance, ran a popular restaurant and hairdressing shop in the Prescott House. He had inherited a large sum of money from his family estate in New Jersey and was able to support his enterprises without any support of white colonial banks and financiers. Most blacks, however, were not as fortunate and were afforded little opportunity to save enough money to invest in such ventures. Most simply survived on what they earned each passing day. And not a few, like Cassie, struggled even to put 2 days of work together. That meant they were ever on the move to find the cheapest places to live. One morning, George woke up to Cassie and Ernest hollering at each other. From what George gathered, Cassie was trying to get Ernest to help her pack, but her son refused. "I'm not living out there," Ernest protested. "Well, we can't afford to live here," cried Cassie. "You can't afford to live here. I'll do fine, you see." Standing at the top of the stairs, George watched Cassie's son thunder down the hallway and slam the front door behind him. George ventured down the stairs and peered into the living room to see Cassie stuffing duffel bags with clothing and linen. As George stood at the entrance, she paused and glanced over at him, long enough for George to see tears following the pained lines across her face. "Well," she said flatly, "are you going to come with me, or walk out that door like every other man in my life?" Cassie had decided to move to Indiantown, as they called it back then. Today, a lot of people have made it known they don't like the use of the name anymore. About 4 years ago, the local council members of St. John agreed to change it, but it seems neither the city or provincial legislators are in any hurry to do so, since nothing's been done about it. At the very least, Indigenous elders should have been consulted by now about how to properly honor the place. Prior to colonists arriving, this was an important gathering place for the land's first inhabitants, who traded on that bend of the river above the dangerous tide which flowed in from the ocean. By the early 17th century, early European fur traders had built a permanent trading store nearby, which they called the Indian House. However, the boom of the industrial era during the 18th century changed the way of life along the river dramatically. Settlers began using the river as a natural conduit for shipping products, sending large steam-propelled barges upstream with lumber and goods. The Indian House became overrun with lumber mills, massive boat docks, supply stores, and eventually homes for the increasing number of immigrant families. In just a short breadth of time, the gathering place of the indigenous peoples became a bustling port of foreign goods in European society. And, with the beaver supply severely diminished, there was no place for the indigenous trader in this new world. Indigenous agriculture on the river had been forever changed by the coming of European settlers. All the farmland along the St. John River had been taken over, after years of being pushed off their traditional territories. By the 19th century, the Wolastoqiyik had been all but forced onto Federal Reserve lands. Meanwhile, life in this fledgling colonial outpost kept going. By the time George found his way there with Cassie, its residents had gained a reputation for living like they were still on the frontier. It attracted those who were still caught up in the entrepreneurial spirit of the generation past and disdained the establishment class of St. John City. Of course, the ability to turn your nose to the elite of society is, ironically, contingent upon your own privilege of freedom to define yourself as you please. Most of the white settlers of Indiantown, as you can imagine, hadn't given much thought to that as Cassie and George trudged up the long main street into town. Racism, unfortunately, lives in the hearts of people, not area codes. Whether folk moved beyond the tracks or down to the lower end of town, people's view of black folk didn't change much. Even though Indiantown on paper existed outside the Charter of St. John, which explicitly excluded blacks from voting or owning businesses, many of the white folk in Indiantown still treated blacks as second-class citizens. As a result, a lot of black families lived a segregated life in Indiantown. Most of them built homes beside each other up the secluded hill along Spark Cove Road, largely hidden out of sight in the thick wooded hillside above the bustling town below. My eldest cousin, Bunker, about life growing up on Spark Cove Road and whether the reputation of Indiantown being a rough place to live was true. Bunker was the son of my Aunt Nornie and Uncle Speed. He talked about how life growing up on the North End taught you two things: how to make a meal out of nothing and how to stick up for one another. Not a day went by when a colored kid didn't have to fight their own way home from school. By virtue of their birthright, the older siblings learned to swing fists faster and harder than anyone. In fact, Bunker recollected how fighting became so mixed in the blood of his cousins that many left home to make a living in the boxing circuits of New England. At the same time, Bunker also spoke of how life together within the black community on Spar Cove Road was full and meaningful for a boy like him. From one end to the other, everyone knew everybody. Boys ran the road together, as he affectionately described it, and most every night got into adventure and mischief up in the woods. But most of all, Bunker recalled the baseball games that happened on the field at the bottom of the hill. Games on Saturdays would be an event everyone on the road came down for, and it would last for hours, and often so far into the night no one could see the ball. The weekend ball game on Spar Cove Road was the stuff of legend. Heroes were born on that field, for there was a time when no one along the East Coast could play ball better than the boys of Spar Cove. Thomas Washington was known as the principal organizer of the first black baseball clubs in New Brunswick. He would post announcements of games against rival teams. The Alerts represented Indiantown and the North End, with the Hector brothers being the stars of the team. James Jumbo Hector was the pitcher. His brother Charles was the catcher, along with his brother Joe at first base, Oscar at third base, and his younger brother George playing in the right field. Touted as the strongest colored nines to be found in the Maritime Provinces, the press noted Jumbo Hector for his graceful curveball and heavy hitting. Games against rival teams would usually be held at the Barrack Square. As was tradition, games would last until it was too dark to see the ball. Often visiting teams would be dressed in the latest attire, while the boys from Spar Cove would show up with a mixture of long and short trousers, sometimes rolling up pant legs to hide the holes in the knees, and a few players with odd shoes who couldn't afford a full pair. But the folk of Spar Cove didn't mind that the crowd snickered at the attire of their young men. By the end of the game, it was them doing the laughing. Now, there was only one thing the black community of Indiantown enjoyed as much as baseball, and that was music. For a colored boy from Indiantown, there were really only three ways to make a name for yourself. You either pitched a good fastball on the field, threw a good punch on the street, or played really good music in the dance hall. To gain popularity as a musician back then, there was no such thing as social media. The only way people heard you is by literally going out onto the street and playing in front of anyone who passed by. Guys would be busking all hours of the day and night on street corners and all the way down to the river docks, competing to grab people's attention. There weren't many places for colored folk to gather, so it meant being creative on the location. For the younger boys, well, it was often just showing up at the same street corner the next day. Now, George was small in figure, and he wasn't fast enough to run bases like the Hector boys, or strong enough to fight in the streets. By the way, there was another George Dixon from the north end of Halifax who was at the height of his boxing career just about the time your grandfather was born. He was known as the Chocolate Bomber. Not much bigger than your grandfather in stature, but probably the greatest fighter that Canada ever seen. Anyway, none of that mattered to your papa, because he fell in love with music. I can picture him, even now, standing at a busy intersection in the late hours of the night, him and his pal. I believe in my father's last dying days, he imagined heaven would be standing on some street corner past those pearly gates, playing his cornet with a crowd dancing in front of him, and no worry in the world. Yes, my father sighed deeply. That would be heaven for my father. I let that image of heaven unfold before me. I tried to picture my grandfather tapping his feet in rhythm with the song, while the polished brass of his cornet caught the radiance of heavenly light shining around him. I was quickly brought back to earth by a phone call that came through the other line. I reluctantly said goodbye to Dad, but assured him I would call again soon to hear the next part of the story. That evening, a lot of questions swirled in my head, not the least of which, I had to admit, was the mysterious figure of Cassie Maxwell. How did my grandfather come to know her? And if Cassie was so special to my grandfather, why did he not stay close to her after the war? Intrigued by this relationship, I decided to see what I could find out about her. In his military attestation paper, George had listed Cassie Maxwell as his next of kin. Upon finding her death certificate, I learned that she had died in 1936 as a widow, naming Ernest as her only survivor. It said that her father was David Dixon, and the identity of her mother unknown. I was interested in learning more about her son Ernest, who figured prominently in my grandfather's story, but out of curiosity, I decided to do a quick check on her father to see how far back her lineage went. Eventually, I found a match to David Dixon by entering Dickson as an alternate spelling that also referenced having a child by the name of Cassie. The link sent me to a census record dated 1881. Before I could scroll down to find her name, another one caught my attention. Apparently, David had a son named George. It said that George, the elder brother to Cassie, was 23 years old at the time of the census, which means he was born around the year 1858. It immediately sparked my curiosity. I started searching his name in the archival records of the state of Rhode Island. I found only one. It was a birth registration for children born in the year 1895. Near the top was listed George Richard Dixon, born July 21st, 1895, to a father, George W., and mother, Catherine. It said George W. was 38 years old, which meant this person would have been born near the year 1858. For the longest time, I stared at the page on the screen. Was I missing something? I thought to myself. Was I really staring at the secret to my grandfather's parents? In the moment, it seemed incredulous that my grandfather was hiding the answer to his past in plain sight. However, as an educator, how many times did I tell students to let the evidence guide them to the most plausible answer to their questions? There seemed little reason to doubt this was the true record of my grandfather's birth. I couldn't find any record of when George's father passed away and whether he ever ventured to see his son again. His name appeared only once more, years later, in a Pawtucket housing directory, dated about the time George left for the war. Perhaps, somehow, George had connected with him in that brief moment when he resurfaced, explaining why he mentioned his father still alive in Rhode Island. As for his mother, Catherine, I could find absolutely No evidence of her existence beyond this single reference. It was safe to presume, like George alluded to in his military file, her life was brief on this earth. Either way, whatever George knew of his parents, he chose to hide them in the past. The next day I called my father and shared every detail I could. For a while, he didn't speak. And then he whispered softly, as if to himself, "Why must I learn this now, when I have no one else to share this with?" As I heard him utter these words, my heart ached for him. He breathed a long sigh, then laughed. "Oh, well, some may never know, because I'm guessing a few of my relatives are in a place I have no intention of going to. Maybe the Lord could send a message through Lazarus, but I ain't planning to join them." As my dad laughed again, I joined in with him. He then continued, "Thank you, son, for sharing this with me. It does help make sense of a lot of things, doesn't it? I always wondered about Cassie Maxwell. But back then life was, well, chaotic, and I never really thought to make sense of it. In those days, we mostly accepted things as they were told us and moved on. I suppose there's so much more to this story, but this is more than I expected to learn in my lifetime. So thank you." "Well," I replied, quite moved by Dad's response, "I wouldn't have arrived at this without the help of Eunice's friends, so we're all indebted. It was meant to be that you should hear it now. I guess that's all that needs to be said." There was another question I was eager to ask him, but it felt it was better to leave it for another day. I said goodbye to him and expressed my hope I could come see him one day soon. He said he'd like that, and we hung up the phone.